Good morning, everyone. We'll be beginning in just a couple minutes. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for joining this webinar. My name is Justin Scoggins, and I'm the data manager at the USC Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration, or CSII, as well as a co-author of the research we'll be presenting today. At CSII, we define immigrant integration as improved economic mobility for, enhanced civic participation by, and receiving society openness to immigrants. We see naturalization and citizenship as a basic and important step toward immigrant integration that facilitates all aspects of this three-part definition. Today, we are very happy to present our latest work in this area, consisting of a report and a new interactive mapping tool. We are very fortunate to have with us today Tai Lei, a CSI researcher, Manuel Pastor, director of CSII, and Melissa Rogers, Director of Programs at the Immigrant Legal Resource Center and Director of the New Americans Campaign. Today's webinar will include a presentation of key findings from our new report, Paths to Citizenship, Using Data to Understand and Promote Naturalization, followed by a demonstration of the online mapping tool that we developed. We will then hear from Melissa Rogers about how this new data and analysis can be useful in the field. Finally, we'll have a few minutes at the end to take questions from participants. You can start typing your questions in the chat box at any time, and our Senior Communications Specialist, Gladys Malabiran, will track them and queue them up for us at the end. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Manuel Pastor. Manuel?
Thank you, Justin, and just making sure this slide thing will change. Great. So I'm going to go ahead and present the research that we did, and again, we really want to acknowledge the support of Melissa and the New Americans campaign, in part for asking the kind of questions that led us to do this. So we know that citizenship is a public good for both the economy and civic engagement. Much of the research we've done in the past looks at what we call the citizen gain, the economic benefits from becoming a citizen, and certainly there are civic gains in terms of immigrants becoming able to vote and participate fully civically. But we also know that the likelihood of who naturalizes varies widely across the 9 million or so people who are eligible to naturalize, and that understanding who is more or less likely to naturalize and where they live can help organizations promoting naturalization figure out how to best allocate their limited resources. So what we did through this is to try to take a look at what factors influence an individual's probability of naturalizing, who are those with low, medium, and high probabilities of naturalizing, and where they are located. I'm not going to get too much into the methodology, although let me just say, if we were into the methodology, you would swoon, because it was just so fantastic. Basically, what we did was use information from the Survey of Income Program and Participation 2014 to figure out a probability model for who was undocumented so that we could then net them out of the non-citizen immigrants to get down to the lawful permanent residents who would have been eligible to naturalize. So this is a brand new data set. We then develop a probability model taking a look at the estimate of whether or not people are likely to naturalize in the next 2 or 3 years by looking at who naturalized in the last 2 or 3 years and what were the factors that were consistent with that. And then, as you'll see, we try to group people into probabilities with the idea that some folks might just need a nudge, some people might need a whole lot of help, and some people might be sort of in the middle. So what were the factors influencing the probabilities of naturalizing? In this multiple regression logistic model that we developed, which essentially means that we're not just looking at sort of crosstabs or differences between groups, so we're saying holding men constant, for example, how does age matter? Or holding age matter, how does race matter? We found that being male, being older at the age of arrival, being married to non-citizens are actually negatively associated with the odds of naturalization. Women naturalize more than men, even controlling for all the other factors. We found that amongst the different sort of broad ethnic groups, Latinx or Latinos were the least likely to naturalize. We found something that we think is really significant we'll come back to. Having a family member who is an undocumented immigrant is a very strong predictor deterring naturalization. Interestingly, even though naturalization might be a way to, in some sense, protect your undocumented family members, there's so much fear of tangling with the system that having an undocumented family member deters people from making a naturalization decision, even controlling for all the other factors. So you can see how all these work in terms of their relative importance. This is a graph looking at the impact and the odds of naturalization. And what you can see is that being male has a slight negative impact. Being married to a non-U.S. citizen has a relatively large negative impact. Having an undocumented immigrant member in the family has a pretty large negative impact. Let's go ahead and forward the slide, which means reducing that thing. So you can also see that education makes a difference. And interestingly, what turns out to be really important is that this is compared to people who have less than a high school degree. Folks who are more likely to naturalize have some college or a bachelor's degree. That's the sort of big difference. We didn't want to just look at the sort of individual factors. We wanted to look at other factors that had to do with the political climate of the state, with the nature of the sending country, etc. So what we found out is that if you come from a country that allows dual citizenship, that has a positive impact on the probability of naturalizing. If you come from a country that's further away, that actually has a positive probability impact on the probability of naturalizing, presumably because you think you won't get back there. The two groups that have the lowest probability of naturalizing are Mexicans and Canadians, both with proximate status. We find that if there's a lot of immigrants in your public use microdata area, which means basically your large neighborhood, a lot more immigrants, probably more immigrants serving organizations, higher probability of naturalizing. In the political climate of the state, if it's more blue, that turns out to have an impact on your probability of naturalizing, which you can see in this chart right here, pretty high impact on the odds of naturalization if you reside in a state that is a blue state, probably more favorable to people naturalizing. So when you look at it that way, then you can see which states are doing better than you would have expected and which states or areas are doing worse than you would have expected. So Wyoming, Florida, Maine, Nevada, Utah, Virginia, Washington, New Jersey, Kentucky, and Rhode Island are actually doing better than you would expect. Looking at all of the, what we did in this is to look at all the individual characteristics and say that if you use just the individual characteristics, what would you expect the probability of naturalizing to be, and then how many people are actually naturalizing in that state. So some of these states are doing better. Big shout out to Florida, Nevada, and Utah, where I know there's organizations in Virginia really working hard on these issues. Kind of a negative shout out to Mississippi and Louisiana, which are places that do have a lot of immigrants but are not doing very well. They're doing worse than you would have expected. And you can see this from a map. California, Arizona, Texas, they're doing about as well as you would have expected given the demographics of their population. You can see the states that are doing better than expected. The state of Washington, for example, is doing better than expected, and the states that are doing worse than you would have expected. Now, one of the reasons we wanted to do this was to identify groups of eligible to naturalize adults. Now, why do this? We wanted to group folks who are eligible to naturalize by whether or not they have a low probability of naturalization, whether they have a medium probability of naturalization, or whether they've got a high probability of naturalization. Why do this? There were really two reasons. One is for the high probability of naturalization folks, they're sort of likely to naturalize. They're going to naturalize pretty close to as soon as they're eligible. What do you need to do to push them? Probably just an information nudge, something that lets them know about what they need to do. For the folks who have a medium probability of naturalization, they're going to need a little bit more support, financial, education, quell their worries about undocumented folks and their families and how this might affect them. For the low probability of naturalization, these are people who are very hard to naturalize. It's still important in terms of equity to spend some time on them, but you need to know that you're really getting into a high cost situation in terms of the yield. And it turns out if you group people by that, about 3.4 million, 40% of the eligible to naturalize population, which is about 9 million folks, have a low probability of naturalization. About 2 million, 25% have a high probability, need a nudge. It's that medium probability of naturalization that groups like NAC are really focused in on. So what does this look like? This kind of is more of a graphic representation of the logistic results that I was presenting before, but you can see here that as you move to the high probability of naturalization, you're moving to a group that's a little bit younger, a little bit more middle-aged. If you move along race by probability of naturalization, as you move to the low probability of naturalization group, that's overwhelmingly Latinx. If you look at the poverty status and you move to the low probability of naturalization, every bar there that's not a dark blue bar is a group at varying levels of the poverty level, but those are all groups below 200% of the poverty level. You can see that as you move to the low probability of naturalization, you're talking about poorer groups and groups that are going to need more support, particularly probably around finances in order to pay the fees, in order to accrue the education. And here you can see also the educational attainment as you move to low probability of naturalization. You're talking about a less educated group, high probability of naturalization, much more likelihood of people to have some college or bachelor's degree. In terms of the English-speaking ability, you can see that the high probability of naturalization group has a lot of English-speaking abilities, particularly compared to the low probability of naturalization group. In some ways, these results are not that surprising to people who provide these services, but what is surprising is the ability to quantify it and the ability to move to a mapping tool, which we'll get to in just a minute. One of the reasons why we did this is we wanted to compare and take a look at who NAC, the New Americans for Citizenship group, is helping. And here what you can see is if you look at the NAC population by age, 42% of the NAC people who have been helped by NAC are in the 35 to 54 category, 15% of the 25 to 34. That's pretty close to the median probability of naturalization. Why that's important is that if you're going to gauge NAC's effectiveness, you shouldn't gauge it across the all eligible to naturalize adult, because most of NAC's efforts are actually directed at people who need some help. They're not so much helping the high probability of naturalization people who would have done it otherwise. They're actually helping the medium probability of naturalization. So if you're looking at their effectiveness by what base you're working with, it shouldn't be all 9 million. It should be the 40% or so that are in the medium probability of naturalization. You can see that as well in terms of the region of naturalization. This is a little bit more complicated. 54% of NAC folks that NAC helps is in North America, which actually means Mexico and Central America, and you can see that that's in the medium probability of naturalization group. And you can see that when you look at the NAC population, 51% of those that they're helping are from Mexico, 17% from the Caribbean, 15% from Central America. That's squarely in the median probability of naturalization. So a better way to gauge NAC's effectiveness is to rank them against the pool that they're actually targeting, not the folks that'll be so hard to naturalize that they're never going to get there, not the folks who need just a nudge, but the folks that really are making that need some additional help. Last thing, appropriately, NAC is reaching more women than they are men. And this is something we're going to come to in terms of our implications of this result. But before we do, one of the things that we do in the report is we do talk a little bit about case studies, and we talk about how those case studies actually fit these probabilities. That citizenship works is probably reaching the high probability group with a nudge effect, that advancing justice, particularly in its work with lower income Southeast Asians, but they actually also work, even though it's an Asian American group, with a lot of Mexican and Central American immigrants. They're reaching a hard to reach population. A group like CASA is kind of working in the middle to naturalization. So what are the policy implications? We think that these results can be used to develop and steer policies. But we think that one thing that we would lift up that's really in particular as an implication is, given the fact that women are more likely to naturalize than men, it may be very important to use women not just to encourage them to naturalize, but to also use them as essentially promotoras, health promoters, ambassadors around citizenship to get other family members to do the same. We think that there needs to be a lot more information so that people can recognize that naturalization can be a way to protect their undocumented family members rather than put them at risk. And we think that we need to understand that political climate of a state deeply matters. One of the ways to sort of more equitably get, or to more effectively promote naturalization, is to look at the spatial characteristics of where people are. And for this, I want to turn things over to Ty to talk about the mapping tool that we developed.
Great. Thank you, Manuel. So good morning, everyone. Before we, the first thing I want to do is give a shout out to one of our very talented data analysts, as well as the map guru of CSI. It's Sabrina Kim, for putting this wonderful, beautiful map together. So to get people started on how to use this great tool to spatially analyze all the results that Manuel just talked about, you can go to this particular link or go to the CSII homepage, and we'll go from there. So for folks who are already on the home page, you can easily just click on the first link that is in the feed, and it'll take you to the page, the interactive map page, where you can see the different eligible to naturalize adults by probability of naturalization. So the default will take you to the PUMA page, and if you want, you can scroll through the page and see all the other resources we have on here, as well as some beautiful graphics, again, made by Sabrina Kim, and instructions on using the map, some of the methodologies that was used, and the acknowledgements as well. So we're going to go ahead and get started actually at the state level. We'll work our way down. So the map is very informative. So you can see here how we have the different states and their different eligible to naturalize proportions. And so right now we are on the all as a default. So this is looking at all eligible adults, whether they have low, medium, or high probability. And to get familiar with the tools, the two primary tools that you will most likely be using on this map are the first two here, where the box with the magnifying glass is just zooming in to wherever you would like, and then the cursor will just let you drag back and forth. And this is particularly helpful when we're looking at smaller geographies. And then you could easily go back to the full view. So how this works is basically you can scroll, you can hover over any particular geographical region. So right now we're over California. It'll show you some demographic information about California. And again, since we are on the all eligible to naturalize, the demographic data is about the entire group here. So we have age, race, educational attainment, poverty status, English-speaking ability, top places of origin, top languages spoken at home. But if we were interested in the low probability of naturalization group, we could just click on that and then hover back on California, and it's going to give us the demographic information about the those with low probability of naturalization. And the same thing with medium and high. Another feature that you can use, if you're interested in looking at geographical regions with similar makeup in terms of the numbers of eligible to naturalize, you can easily just click on it, and it will highlight other states or other geographical regions with similar numbers as well. But let's go ahead and go back to the PUMA level and to see a little bit more how the tool works. So we can click on the magnifying tool, and let's zoom into where we currently are at in Los Angeles at the University of Southern California to get a better idea of how this map can work. So if we're interested to see how the demographic and immigrant makeup is in near where we are, we could just easily hover over the PUMA here. So let's see. Where is, it should be around here, yes. And you can see how the age, race, educational attainment, all that is referring to the all eligible to naturalize group here as a reminder. And then if we're interested in the low, we can easily switch. And what's great about this map is it keeps the same focus of the area we are interested in. The same thing when we click medium and high and so on. And just because there's a lot of information, like wonderful information on here, just be a little patient if it does take some time to load. And then for those who are more on the policymaking side and interested on congressional districts, we can also look at that. And this is also very interesting as well. But very quickly, just going back, I do want to point out that there are some particular areas because of the low amount of, so there are some areas that will have no data, and that's just because the sample size is very small, and that wouldn't give us enough variability to make any statistical significant conclusions with that. So just for those who are interested. So going back to the congressional districts. So again, if we're interested in the area surrounding USC, you can easily zoom in there as well. And for those with the scroll on your mouse, you can scroll back and forth with that easily. So if we are interested in, for example, California's 28th congressional district, and we want to see how they are affected in terms of immigrant-related policies. We can click on that to see perhaps like what are the top languages spoken at home. So we can create more pamphlets or informational sheets in Spanish, for example, that are related to naturalization. But again, this is very awesome map, very comprehensive, and again, thanks to Sabrina and Kim for putting it together. You could lose hours just exploring the different areas that you're interested in. With that, I'm going to give it back to Justin.
One comment on the way from Manuel, which is there's a related set of maps maybe Justin can find that are also go back and let you know some basic data about the eligible to naturalize, particularly by congressional district, which would allow you simply to know, for example, what share or what would be added to the citizen voting age public if people who were in that congressional district were to naturalize. And that's a much more basic set of maps that we updated and is available, and would also help with policy when you're thinking about indicating to someone who's a policy maker what share of potential voters might be added to their district if there was to be a naturalization campaign in that particular district, state, etc. Let me turn things back over to Justin.
Yeah, thanks, Manuel. And I should mention that in the PowerPoint that you'll be able to download with the recording, and on the page, there are instructions of how to access this older set of maps, but that have been updated with the same data set in this project. So thank you very much for the detailed demonstration, Ty. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. And now we're going to hear from Melissa Rogers, director of the New Americans Campaign, which has done and continues to do a ton of work to support and promote naturalization. Let's make sure we can hear her, so we'll unmute her. And so in order for us to do research that can really make an impact, we need good partners. And Melissa and the New Americans Campaign have been wonderful partners to us, and were instrumental in raising some of the initial questions that really led to this research. So we're very happy to have Melissa with us today. And now I'll turn it over to her to give us a sense of how this data can be used to inform the work and the strategy of the New Americans Campaign. Melissa?
Thank you, Justin. And let's see if I can make these slides move forward. I'm giving it a try. I want to thank Manuel, Ty, Justin for great partnership, and as well as my colleague Sarah Letson, who is our best practices manager and our data person, and who worked closely with the team over at University of Southern California on helping to ask the right questions. So thank you. We're really very glad to partner on this work. And I know that many New Americans Campaign partners are on this webinar right now. But for attendees who may not know us, the New Americans Campaign, or the NAC, we're a nonpartisan national campaign. We have over 200 local and national organizations working together on a singular goal of increasing naturalization. And let's see if I can control these slides. There we go. The Immigrant Legal Resource Center, which is the organization where I work, has the privilege of leading the campaign. But as you can see from the map, we really are hundreds of organizations, and together we've generated hundreds and thousands of naturalization applications working in diverse communities across the United States. And our efforts are to transform the way lawful permanent residents, or LPRs, become new Americans by using new models to provide legal assistance, and by innovating how we reach and inform LPRs. And so, as you might imagine, having data about LPRs along the lines of the data that was just presented is absolutely essential to our work. Let's see. I'm having a little trouble advancing the slides. There we go. Obviously, we know naturalization matters, and Manuel talked about a number of the reasons. There's some immigration benefits that are very important, particularly right now in a pretty hostile climate for immigrants. protection from deportation being a very important one, status for other family members that U.S. citizens can help achieve, and the ability and right to vote, as well as economic benefits that Manuel and his team documented in a study that is referenced on this slide, which is a really interesting read, and I encourage anybody on this webinar who hasn't read it to take a look. We yet face a persistent challenge. We have 9 million people who are lawful permanent residents who've had their green cards for 5 years or more and are potentially eligible to apply for naturalization. And we're seeing only 750,000, sometimes 850,000 applications for naturalization per year. We did get to almost 1 million in federal fiscal year 2017, but generally speaking, more green cards are becoming available than people are applying for naturalizing. And as a result, we have insufficient resources to reach and serve all eligible LPRs. And though we have the support noted on a previous slide of a collaboration of national and local funders, foundations that have invested in the work, we need to be really mindful of how we deploy our resources, because there's no way that we're going to be able to serve the 9 million. And as Manuel was saying, in the New Americans campaign, we've done a good job of targeting our resources primarily at the medium eligible to naturalize, and have made some dent. But knowing who we're trying to reach, what their characteristics are, can really inform our strategy. So whether we choose to target the medium probability, or, in some cases, we may have reasons to target some low probability, or we want to stretch to targeting the high probability, using the data that was presented, the detailed level of understanding about the demographics allows us to figure out, is this a population we want to target? If so, what outreach method or outreach methods do we want to use? What messaging do we need to put in place that's going to resonate with this target? And what service model do we need to have ready so that it's going to be an appealing ask when we're making a call to action to the populations we've targeted? The data inform many levels of our strategy. First and foremost, our outreach and our messaging. When we are determining what we want to say, what kinds of images we want to use, knowing whether we're targeting low or medium or high probability, probably in this case, if we're doing outreach, we're trying to target either a medium or a high. We're either trying to give them a nudge or we're trying to share information. And so when we're using social media, or whether we're engaging in a paid campaign where we're actually paying to place an ad on social media or television or radio, or if we're using ambassadors in the community who are going to be the voice to reach out to their peers, knowing who we're targeting is what we need to be able to target our outreach. The platforms, some social media platforms have very sophisticated tools allowing all of us to choose our audience according to the characteristics of the populations we're trying to reach. We're also, within the New Americans campaign, engaged in a national effort. It's still a pilot, and we're doing it in partnership with the digital strategy firm 18 Coffees and the digital marketing firm Craft and Commerce. But we're engaged in a national pilot to reach the high likelihood and medium likelihood to naturalize populations in various geographies. We're testing messages that are going to resonate. So we're using digital and social advertising to test messages, and having access to fairly granular data about the characteristics of the population allow us to plan our messaging and then allow us to measure the success against known data about the population. We're then following up, once we've targeted, and you can see we're targeting broadly, we're going to have leads of people who share contact information, and then be able to test follow-up emails or texting, peer-to-peer approaches, WhatsApp, and again be able to see which populations are responding to which messages and whether we're getting different responses from the high likelihood to naturalize, the medium likelihood, and then we're going to direct them to pathways. and see which pathways towards naturalization, be it an online pathway with virtual assistance, or perhaps a need for in-person assistance or hotline support or more information, is going to be best suited to moving that particular slice of the eligible to naturalize towards the ultimate goal of applying for naturalization. We also think that data can inform your partnerships, not only with whom you partner, but also how you partner. So once you have a sense of which population you're trying to reach, for example, perhaps you're trying to reach a population with high likelihood of naturalization, and you're looking at a particular population of immigrants from Africa, and you are looking at which faith-based entities are going to be most likely, or community service entities or colleges are going to be most likely to have contact with your target population or already provide services to that population. And then you can come up with a joint strategy. This is also very powerful if you're working with local governments, where local governments, particular cities and counties and states that have decided to invest in citizenship, once you know what kinds of populations you're targeting together, you can craft a much more sophisticated strategy and a much more sophisticated outreach plan. All right, let's try to move this slide. Here we go. Once people are interested in applying for naturalization, understanding the characteristics of your target audience is also essential to crafting your service model. You want to be shaping a service model that is going to be the most appealing to the population you're trying to reach. And you can use the mapping tool to do things like plot the location of the next naturalization event you're hosting, if it's an in-person event, recruiting the right kinds of volunteers. If you're putting a do-it-yourself ask to a high likelihood of naturalizing, you may want to know what kinds of online pathways or what kinds of additional supports you want to be making available for folks who are going to want to get a little bit of information or just a little bit of a nudge. Conversely, if you're targeting a population that's going to have a high need for assistance, or you're going into a rural community and you're putting a van out there, understanding what languages, what level of education you're going to be needing to serve is really, really important. And so once you really delve into the PUMA level of your maps, you should be able to use the data to make a much more sophisticated service model. And this is certainly the ask we're asking within the New Americans campaign. So as Manuel was saying, we have largely, but not exclusively, served the medium eligibility to naturalize. Within the New Americans campaign, we're also using the data right now to ask our partners to experiment with innovative strategies to move the highly likely to naturalize to do so. And together, we're going to be delving into questions like, how might we target the high likely to naturalize? How might we incentivize that population to start the process on their own? How might we partner with our networks of influencers to mobilize lawful permanent residents that are highly likely? And then what service models are going to appeal to this population? So information nudges, more services, those sorts of things. And having this data is an unprecedented opportunity for the field to use our limited resources in a way that is both mission aligned and also highly strategic. So on that note, I'm going to hand this back to Justin Scoggins for the question and answer portion of the webinar, and we are just thrilled to be able to use the data.
All right, thank you very much, Melissa. So now we'll transition to the question and answer portion of the webinar. If you haven't already, please type questions in the questions box, and we'll queue them up. So there's a variety of questions here about the presentation. So the PowerPoint that we went through, it will be available on the page hosting the report after the webinar is done. And that you can access that at the report page link shown on the screen here. And and there are other questions sort of about the presentation, the data, but here's one perhaps for Ty. What is the criteria and steps used to decide how the geographical data is broken down?
Thanks, Justin. So there's a lot of different goals in terms of what this data can be used for. So right now we have the information broken down by states, by PUMAs, which is a public use microdata area that is often used by the census as well as the congressional district. And the reason why we chose these three particular geographical regions, geographical levels, is because they are able to present different comparisons. So if we're interested, for example, in state-level policies, you can see how different states differ compared to each other. But if we're more interested in how larger neighborhoods, like sub-county neighborhoods, are differ from one to each other, then we can look at PUMAs, which are typically housing of approximately 100,000 people. And then for congressional districts, that's particularly important, especially when we're trying to see if representatives who are wanting to develop more policies that are more oriented towards immigrants as well as more immigrant friendly, then they can use that as a tool to explore more of that particular region.
So this is Manuel, and this gets at a question that is perhaps beneath that question, which is, how is this data different than what is normally available from the Office of Immigration and Statistics? Some of you are familiar with the fact that the Office of Immigration and Statistics puts out a number for the eligible to naturalize, people who are eligible but have not yet naturalized, of roughly 9 million, and that also lists them by the country that they came from and by the state, quote unquote, that they reside in. Those are aggregate numbers, and the way that the Office of Immigration and Statistics does that is they say, well, where did you get your green card? And if you have a naturalized since, they assume you're still living where you got your green card, or where you last renewed your green card. And those are aggregate statistics without any individual characteristics attached. What is novel about this data is that we figured out how to, in the American Community Survey, which are the individual answers to the census, estimate who among the non-citizen immigrant population is eligible to naturalize. Again, we did that by first estimating who was undocumented, netting them out. Then we net out folks who are likely to be here on student visas or other sort of short-term visas, and we wind up with a population that's likely to be an LPR population. And then we apply the criteria in terms of the number of years they need to have been here, or if they're married, they need to be here less years, or if they were in the military, etc. When we are done, we come up with a number that matches the Office of Immigration Statistics number at an aggregate level, and in particular in terms of the countries that people are from. But what's cool about our data set is we've got where they live now, not where they last renewed their green card, and we've got all of their individual characteristics. And that's what makes it possible for us to estimate the factors behind their probability of naturalization. It's also the case that the lowest geographic level at which this individual data is given is the public use microdata area, and that's why that's the lowest geographic level, or most specific geographic level that we wind up showing in the maps. For the rest of the congressional districts, we kind of crosswalk people from the PUMAs into the congressional districts that they're part of. That's a little bit easier at the state level. But again, the really cool thing is if you think about what comes from OIS, Office of Immigration Statistics, you've got a big aggregate number without a lot of characteristics behind it. Now you've got a number that matches that big aggregate number, but it's one that's got a lot of individual characteristics to let you be able to explore the gender characteristics, the family characteristics, the political climate characteristics, the nature of the neighborhood characteristics. Justin, are there more questions that have shown up?
Yes, there are. So there's one question for Melissa, is about how do you go about becoming a member or a affiliate of the New Americans campaign? Melissa? Let me.
There we go.
Oh, there you are.
I thought you had to unmute me. I am so sorry. I was on mute, and I needed to be able to be unmuted. So to become a member of the New Americans campaign, we have a couple ways that we think about our work. On the map that you saw earlier, we have places where we're working in deep collaborations, where organizations are very deliberately working together on a strategy. And those are our sites, and largely we use the funding that we have to support that work by passing it through to our partners. We also have affiliates who join our campaign, and these are organizations that really embrace what we're trying to achieve, which is an increase in naturalization, and embrace the principles we use to do the work, which are a principle around having a high numerical impact, doing the work collaboratively with other service providers, but also with many other types of partners like the ones I showed on the slide earlier, a commitment to innovation. And that would include things like using the data that Manuel and his team have put together to figure out new outreach strategies, new service delivery models, new ways of doing the work. Diversity is a principle of ours, meaning we are really committed to reaching and serving the populations that are eligible to naturalize in our country. And quality, meaning that we do vet partners for the quality of legal services to ensure that we're not going to put anybody in harm's way. Having said that, then organizations that think this resonates can reach out to me, and we can talk about you'd have to be bringing your own funding to the table, but we then provide an incredible network of peer-to-peer learning and of being together in this effort to increase naturalization across the U.S.
Thank you very much, Melissa. So we have another question that I guess I'll ask first to you, but the rest of the crew can jump in as well. How is this data going to help with outreach? Is it just to inform of the barriers we have in our area, or is this information just here for us to use as a tool when entering spaces for outreach?
I would say both. I think that on the one hand, this is also going to depend on what outreach method you're using. But so let's say your outreach method is you have a social media strategy and you're going to place ads, paid ads in social media. Well, at that point, once you know, we want to be targeting more folks who are going to come to our workshops, and so we think that's largely the medium probability to naturalize. Or we want to put more people in our community on a path to at least starting the process on their own and giving them that nudge. And to that end, we want to target the high likelihood to naturalize. Being able to understand what the characteristics, demographic characteristics are, what languages does that high or medium population speak, what education level do they have, income levels, those sorts of things, not all of them, but many of them can be used to build targeting in a platform such as Facebook, and to be able to put ads out there that are targeting a subset of folks, and then once you get results, you can actually do replication of the most successful strategies you've put forward to continue to reach people. If your outreach strategy is more of an ambassador word-of-mouth strategy, where you're partnering deeply with community-based organizations and people you've served previously, who are going to go out into their communities and recruit people within their communities to come out for services, again, understanding who do you want to be targeting is going to allow you to choose who you partner with and who you recruit as your ambassadors. And then, of course, it does help you understand barriers, because once you know, for example, what are the characteristics of the low probability to naturalize, you may understand why a group you've been trying to reach is just not showing up. And you may then decide to deploy your resources differently, or, depending, and, New Americans Campaign funds are primarily directed not at the least likely, but you may have other grant funding that you're using for services to folks who are very low likely to naturalize, but yet very mission critical for you. And there, really understanding what the demographic makeup of that population is allows you to possibly break through some of the barriers.
So just a few words on this from Manuel. I think some of this is about trying to figure out what your purpose is with regard to the naturalization. So for example, if you were trying to add a lot of citizen voters and you were on a particular timeline, you might lean a lot more to the high probability and medium probability, because that's going to yield a higher yield quicker. If you've got a lot of social equity and social justice concerns, you might very much lean toward the low probability and medium probability. It's also, we think, a very handy way to get back to reporting to funders. Because if a funder is asking a question, there's 9 million people, why did you only naturalize 3? But your efforts were really directed at the low probability of naturalization. 3 might be a pretty big number. If you are using a nudge technique, you're really only going to reach the high probability. So if you've got a yield from the nudge technique, you can say, well, the base I was really going after was this. So part of the reason why we developed this was so that you could judge much more effectively what the particular intervention was to promote naturalization against the base that you think that intervention would be the most successful at. Finally, I cannot stress enough the gender impacts and the way in which we think that beginning to recognize how much more likely women are to naturalize amongst all of these different groups, and how you could promote promotora campaigns, ambassador campaigns that would actually also provide employment for local community-based people could be really important.
Great. Thank you, Manuel. So I think we have time for just one more question. There are a bunch, again, about the PowerPoint. It will be downloadable. All the slides will be there. This recording is available. And I think for our last question, it's about having an undocumented family member. So you had mentioned that having an undocumented family member is a significant indicator of whether an individual is less likely to pursue naturalization. Do you feel the New American Community Survey gives an underestimate of this population for the fear of reporting this? Are you following up beyond the survey?
The American Community Survey's ability to capture people who are likely to be undocumented has decreased over time, partly because the American Community Survey is perceived as quite voluntary and does not receive the promotion that the census receives with every decade, partly because of the increased fear of tangling with the government. I guess to just reassure you, we understand those problems and have tried to adjust for them in the methodology to try to get closer to a number that's closer to what most analysts believe is the number of the undocumented, by taking into account the reluctance to fill out the formula and the specific undercount that might be associated with the undocumented. However, another implication here is whether or not there might be some reforms with the N-400 form, which is the naturalization form, which asks you about the legal status characteristics of your family members. I'm not really sure why you need to know that on the part of the federal government in order for someone to become a citizen. I'm not sure why that's relevant information. And it's obviously intimidating information to have to impart. And I think that there may be some room for policy reform there. There's certainly room for education amongst for the organizations to do education, saying, yes, it's fearful if you've got an undocumented family member to go through this process, but also if you become a citizen, you may have access to resources and status that will allow you to better protect yourself and those undocumented family members over time. So we just think it's an important educational point to lift up as well.
Thank you very much, Manuel. And so that was our last question, but I would like to ask Melissa if you have any final words to say before we close here.
I only have a huge thank you to your team and an emphasis for everybody who's been listening that this really is an unprecedented data set and an incredible opportunity to, at a moment where we are trying to reach as many people as possible and help them to do it. And so I encourage you to really put this into your thinking cap and shape your strategy around it.
Thank you very much, Melissa. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone again for joining the webinar and thank the presenters for making this possible. Again, we will be posting a recording of the webinar and the PowerPoint presentation you saw on our website alongside the report, which you can access at the link on the screen. And with that, we'll close the webinar. Thank you very much.